Hi students, Dr. Newmark here for your week 2 highlights video. In our video for today, we are going to focus on the scholarly article by Reddish and Barnum. I hope that you've also watched the video in our class that was from the undergraduate version of this class that talks a bit about the more textbook material that you read also for this week, in which you were introduced to some more concrete terminologies and practices of the usability and usability testing UX domain. So let's jump into this article. So I've read this article many times. I've quoted from it in my own scholarship. I find it really accessible, usable, if you will. And I love the sort of personal tone of it, how Reddish and Barnum both speak to their paths to the field and to prominence in the field of human-centered design, usability, and usability testing. In fact, they have been involved with both of the organizations whose logos you see on the screen right now, the UXPA, which is the current international organization for people in the field of usability and user-centered design, and STC, the Society for Technical Communication. So in this article, Overlap, Influence, and Intertwining, the Interplay of UX and Technical Communication, they talk about the history of this field that of UX and usability testing that very much operates at the interstices between information design and architecture, audience focus, user orientation, and communication. They say early in the article, in fact, that technical communications history is deeply intertwined with usability and UX, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later in this video. So Reddish offers the idea that technical communicators are, by nature, user-centered. So this is a little bit of a giveaway question here, but I'm wondering if you agree that audience attunement, which is what we're trained to do in technical and professional communication, and user-centeredness are the same thing. Do you think those are always the same? I like to push against this a little bit because I do think that we've had this anthropocentric default historically to think always of our users as humans. When we think of audience, we think of people usually. But users maybe aren't always people. I want to push against these sort of narrow concepts of our typical conceptions of audience. I'm not saying that, you know, a dog has the same cognitive capacity that we do, but sometimes you don't have a homogeneous user base. And so we need to be very nuanced when we think about this. So I found Reddish's attention to her path to UX really interesting. I loved her mention of this late 1970s study of the problems that people have understanding typical government documents. I was going to share it with you in this video, but I'll probably, hopefully share it in a future video. I spend my outside of teaching time, my research time, looking at documents from over 100 years ago, written within the United States government bureaucracy out of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the Office of Indian Affairs as it was previously known. And so I see a lot of documents that were created within the Department of the Interior, instructions that were circulated to Native American reservations, formerly called agencies across the United States, and what different officials in these communities were expected to do in terms of reporting on activities in those communities. Regarding people and finances and livestock and buildings and all of these things. And I think about how dense those documents were 120 years ago and before that and after that, and how certainly many of the people receiving these had problems understanding these government documents that were very typical. They were a typical part of their job, an everyday part of their job. So hopefully I'll share some of those with you just as a historical side note. So there's a rub, a point of friction or stress between programmers, for example, who are less inclined to usability test along the way. And I think some of you mentioned this in your introduction materials from the discussion board, that you've seen incidences where perhaps testing would have prevented ultimate problems from emerging when an output was circulated to its actual users. So we do see with programmers a disinclination from slowing down along the development process to user test as a project or product is in development, and more inclination to rely on technical communicators in the late stages to offer documentation to help users solve problems. So this isn't a very ultimately probably economical or efficient process to ask for late stage fixing of problems, because as some of you noted in the discussion board, there can be danger, human catastrophe, or on a lower stakes level, lots of frustration when users aren't kept in mind from the very beginning invention stages of a project or a process. So they mention, actually Reddish mentions this project called the Voting and Usability Project. I think it's a really interesting project. Historically, over the last several decades, we've heard of lots of problems with voting, documentation surrounding voting. So I encourage you to look at a presentation that Reddish created that I've shared the link to beneath this YouTube video, and you can see what she has to say directly about that project. So I want you to consider as well the symmetry between usability and plain language. Many of you know about the I don't want to say dominance, but the encouragement that communicators in the public sphere have been, that they've received to communicate in plain language. So usability, this quote reads, and plain language both mean that the people who use or should use what you develop can find what they need, understand what they find, and use what they find to meet their needs. And again, I think back to these historical documents that I spend a lot of time reading, and I'm not sure that they were designed so that people could find what they needed, understand what they found, and use what they found to meet their needs. It's very bloated, it's very sort of amplified language, but there are incidences where the person composing the document will directly say, this is how you need to write this and what you need to do in this report. Those are glimmers of thinking about how the recipient of their instructions is going to use that information to create the output. So this image is generated in a Google Images search of someone seeking to transition from one career to another, choosing one of several paths. So in the realm of usability and UX, so usability has moved over time from a focus on testing to a focus on design throughout the development process to UX, which unfolds contexts of use. I talk to my beginning level technical communication students about context of use so much, explaining that if you're creating a physical, tangible piece of documentation that someone's going to use on a work site, that context of use, the noise, the environmental factors, all of those things are crucial to consider when you're creating something. Similar to how if you're creating something that is a warning in a public building, the fact that it is used in that particular context with that level of light, with the ability of people to get close to it or whether they need to remain far from it, is crucial for people to consider when they are designing. And UX, where we are now, purportedly attends to those kinds of factors. So back to this image. So Reddish refers to the fact that many people transform themselves over their careers, and she gives examples of how she did this. I want you to think about how you have done this, or whether you anticipate doing this down the line. Regarding having audience attunement or user orientation, would this allow you to perhaps transition into a different field or have different dimensions of the job that you currently have? So where I started before graduate school was in the field of public relations and engineering communication, and then I went to grad school in literary studies, and then I transferred back into technical and professional communication. And I think about all the sort of twists and turns of my own path as a educator over the last 20 years and as a public relations person before that. And my interest in usability and user-centered design has sort of grown out of my practice as a technical communication instructor and our insistence upon audience awareness. So in the section written by Carol Barnum, She addresses the ways in which technical communication students need to position themselves to secure UX jobs. And this is obviously really important. Like, this is where the rubber meets the road. How are you going to get a job with your training in a field that is growing and is in need of new hires, right? So take a little bit of time after you watch this video to test whether things have changed, things have improved in the last 10 years or so regarding the infusion of TPC folks into the UX world. I, in fact, have something of a finger on the pulse concerning this because I help my undergraduate students try to find jobs or internships using their tech comm skills to break into usability research or usability testing. And I think, well, I won't reveal what I found just in this last spring's search. I'm really curious what you find when you search some job boards for these search terms and how tech comm skills appear or do not appear in these ads. So she mentions Aristotle's rhetorical framework of audience, purpose, and context of use. If you've had anything to do with our first year writing program, you are very savvy about how we teach freshman level writing outputs in relationship to these concepts. But if you think about the foundation of tech comm in rhetoric, you can understand that by necessity, we're always concerning ourselves with questions about users. So to finish up this video, I just want to touch quickly on, I'm going to hold up a prop here, Don Norman's book, The Design of Everyday Things. We're going to read it a little bit later on this semester, but Barnum quotes Don Norman to this effect. Technical writers should be the key to the entire operation of human-centered design. Think about that. What do you think about that claim based on your workplace history and any other tech comm classes you've taken at UNM or elsewhere at this point, or tech writers who you've worked with? That would be an interesting test. So finally, what are some of the stereotypes that TPC folks face when attempting to enter UX domains where people might have degrees in psychology or human factors or software engineering, whatever it might be? What might the stereotypes about tech comm people be, and how would those be barriers that TPC folks would need to surmount in order to enter these teams? Or how do we just need to re-educate around the value that tech comm people bring to these teams? So I've included an image on the screen from Tom Johnson's blog, I'd Rather Be Writing. If you've taken other classes with me, you may have heard me refer to this. This is his representation of where a tech writer is situated in a software development schema. It's interesting. You can visit his blog. He's still writing it. He's been writing it, I think, for over 15 years. He has a lot of interesting things to say, and I took this image from his website. So on that note, I will see you in a video next week. Again, there's always 2 videos a week, one from my undergrad version of the class, which are really good foundations for you to also listen to, and then the videos for grad students, which talk about the theoretical scholarly article texts for each week. On that note, I'm going to sign off. Have a great rest of your day.